Hello and welcome to Early Childhood Ireland's podcast. Our podcast features interviews and discussions on all issues relating to quality early learning and care, with a range of speakers who are leaders in the areas that matter to Early Childhood Ireland members. I'm Maura Corbett and I work with Early Childhood Ireland. You're most welcome to this series of the podcast where we're discussing and exploring various aspects of STEM or STEAM, how we enable and support children to fun across the areas of science, technology, engineering, maths, arts, creativity. My guest for this episode is Nicola O'Reilly. Nicola currently is a lecturer and researcher in the School of Language, Literacy and Early Childhood Education in DCU. She originally studied social science in UCD and worked in housing, but in the year 2000, she returned to college to study Montessori education in London. And she worked there for several years before returning to Ireland. And then she opened her own setting in Kilkenny, which she ran until 2021. She completed a Master's of Education with a specialism in early childhood education in Maynooth University in 2020. And she now teaches inquiry-based learning and STEM in ECE, technology in ECE and early maths. And she's also a placement tutor on the BE Ed in early childhood education in DCU, that's BA. She also is a research assistant on a number of different projects related to all things STEM or STEAM, and she's a co-chair of the STEAM network. So I think you can see that Nicola's very busy and wears lots of different hats, and as that ideal kind of combination of academic research and rigor that she can bring to the interest, but fundamentally that practice experience of working with children, introducing the concepts of STEM and STEAM to very young children. So Nicola, I'm really looking forward to our conversation and hearing lots of, kind of practical ideas and how children respond to this kind of inquiry-based learning through play. So thanks a million for agreeing to come on the podcast today.
Thanks very much for asking me, Maura. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you today as well.
So I've actually been wanting to talk to you for a while, Nicola, because I heard your great online presentation at our research day a couple of years ago on your master's thesis. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. And I know you're going to come to it and combining that with STEM. But before we come to the specifics of that, can you tell us a little bit about, fill in maybe some of the blanks on that, the bones of that introduction, and how your interest in the areas of STEM and STEAM developed over the years?
So I think there's a fairly natural thread if you look back through my life, connecting lots of bits around STEAM. So I always had a really great love for the natural world, which would have come from my own parents. So my mother loved animals, and my father loves nature, everything to do with nature, and particularly gardening. So I think that was in my blood from early on. And then I loved science in school. I actually did all 3 science subjects for my Leaving Cert, much to many of my teachers' horror, which they thought was a really bad idea, but I was determined and I did it anyway. And I went on then and I did social science in UCD, and so that science thing was there. I worked in housing then for a long time, but I went back to college in London when I moved to London, and I studied Montessori education, and I really found Montessori's scientific approach to education for young children really appealing. Her ideas around supporting children to develop that kind of mathematical mind and way of thinking, and also the way she thought of introducing children to scientific concepts through their innate love of nature. All of that really excited me and sat well with my own way of thinking. And I absolutely fell in love with Montessori education. And I definitely brought that love of nature and science into my work, working as a Montessori educator. One of my first things that I created as a Montessori student was a counting game, and it was made of I made number cards and then these little tiny painted clay eggs that matched bird species that laid those eggs, and the children loved them. So that was one of the first things I did as a Montessori educator. So then when I came back to Ireland, I had my own children, and I began learning about Ashtar, and that really disrupted my way of thinking in terms of my experience so far in early childhood education. So I remember doing a course with the wonderful Kathleen Chute from Early Childhood Ireland on Ashtar and the play-based curriculum. And it really interrupted all of my existing theories around early childhood education. And suddenly I needed to fit play into a play-based curriculum into my Montessori curriculum. And I needed to kind of fit that in there to work in Ireland in early childhood education with Ashtar. So that led to a lot of soul searching, I suppose, in terms of my own philosophy and my own pedagogy, and that eventually led me to do the masters in Maynooth in early childhood education. So I think that was about me needing to be clear in my own head about what my role as an educator was in a play-based setting, and I could feel that the play-based setting was right, and I could feel myself moving into that in terms of my own practice in my own setting. But I needed to understand what my role was, because in Montessori, your role as an educator is really clear. And Montessori lays that out really clearly. But for a play-based setting, I had so many questions. So eventually my thesis was about the way adults co-playing with children and being present during their play can support their learning. And that kind of helped me to understand what my role was. So then in terms of my own practice, I would say that in my own setting, my strengths were definitely in the areas of science, particularly things like living things and dinosaurs, botany through gardening, and also things like the solar system and planets and so on. And then also another of my strengths, I would say, was in creativity, particularly sociodramatic play, and then things like process art, messy play, open-ended materials, lots and lots and lots of freedom and choice, and listening to children. So we were out in the garden every day, no matter what the weather was, and so a lot of my practice would have been outdoors as well. And I loved also just asking children questions and wondering with them, and just trying to help them figure out what their investigations were and what their interests were, and trying to help them with their inquiries. And that word wonder for me really came from Carmel Brennan. She would have taught me around play in the Masters in Maynooth. And she was saying all the time to us, that question, I wonder. And I loved that. So yeah, there's a lot of people there.
Yeah, I wonder is a great one, because I think there's kind of the curious bit and there's the awe bit, and that bit of introducing children to the wonder of the world. It's interesting. I'm going to go back to the start of what you were saying there about Montessori, because you might have heard me mention when I was chatting to Sandra O'Neill a couple of weeks ago for the first episode of this series. I was saying that I was not good at anything science or mathsy or anything at all in school, not my forte in the slightest. And it was when I went to Montessori College in Sign Hill way back in the day that things, fractions beyond a half, started to make sense to me, because there was that concrete representation. And I think her scientific approach to maths, to arithmetic, to geometry really was, it can be such a support to help us to those of us who need that kind of concrete abstraction bit that she talked about, and I think it's keeping those bits that are kind of core, and then maybe letting go of the bits that are of their time, as we've let go of an awful lot of other things that are of their time. And I often feel if you go back to the principles of Montessori rather than getting hung up on the method, an awful lot of what she had to say resonates with with Ashton and our own
Yeah,
thinking today, doesn't
absolutely,
it?
because her philosophy wasn't wrong, and
Not at
also
all.
I think her ideas, the way she organized things, clarity with which she did that was fabulous. But I always remember Barbara Isaacs, who would have been one of my lecturers on the Montessori course in London, and I remember at the end of the year when we were finished, she said to our class, she said, if you had none of these materials, could you still be a Montessori practice? And a lot of us were kind of going, God, I don't know if you could really call yourself a Montessori practice. And we had a lot of debate around it. And her take on it was, it's the philosophy. If you took all the materials and you just put them outside the door and you just taught with her philosophy, you'd be in a good place and you could call yourself a Montessorian. And I would definitely agree with that.
Yeah, that would concur with my thinking. It's taken a little bit of time maybe to get there because, particularly I suppose the sensorial material and geometric material and everything is seen as so integral. But, as I say, when you go back to the child-centered, following the lead of the child, peer learning, mixed ages, so many of the things. But anyway, we digress a little bit, but it's an interesting discussion. So you've mentioned, Nicola, about how that interest in STEAM developed from your own childhood and then your work with children. Why do you think it matters so much? Why why should we focus on it in terms of supporting children's learning?
So there's lots of different reasons really, but I suppose a lot of people nowadays would talk about those kind of future factors. So children developing skills and knowledge that will support later learning and open up careers for them down the road. And Chip Donahue in the States, who talks a lot about technology, talks about that being a bit of a fallacy, and he's right. I think like young children don't really care about their future careers when we're talking about children that we're talking about. But I think in terms of policy, it's really important that we're planning with that in mind. So we do early literacy and we do early maths because we want to give young children skills that's going to help them later on down the road. And I think that's important for STEM as well. So the research shows that particularly for marginalised groups and girls in particular, getting early opportunities to engage in STEAM learning and see themselves represented in STEAM activities and careers is massively important. And if it doesn't happen early on, you see children starting primary school on the back foot, and that impacts their learning for years to come. So some research shows that children in their earlier years also start to rule themselves out of particular careers. And I think a lot of the time, I think that's due to that stereotype identity in their head that people in STEM careers, have. So that idea of it being white, male, middle class and nerdy. So I think that we need to be really careful that we're allowing young children to see themselves represented as capable of STEM careers. So, and I think we need to plan and implement our early childhood education model in this country with that in mind. And I know the Department of Education is working on that with that STEM education implementation plan. And Ashton is being updated, and we're going to see more STEM in there. And also the Ashton Shield to Practice Guide, we can see there's much more guidance in there around how to do STEM learning for young children. But also STEM learning is about things like curiosity and investigating and experimenting and all those lovely things that we're trying to, those positive learning dispositions that we're also trying to instill in young children. And we see that in the Ashton Shield to Practice Guide. You can see those positive learning dispositions, and they sit really well together. A lot of them are the same kind of things,
Yeah, I think those
it also teaches children really useful. So it also teaches young children those kind of really useful habits of mind, like self-regulation, systematic thinking, creativity. And if it's done really well, it supports even those higher order thinking skills like evaluating and analysing things. And then there's all the other ones like social skills like collaborating and teamwork and the emotional stuff as well. So there's loads in that. But I think most importantly of all is that, children care about this stuff. Children are massively curious about the world around them. Ask any parent of a child of 2 or 3 or 4 years old. They're always asking questions and testing things out and trying to figure out how the world works. And if you think of the work of someone like Alison Gopnik, who's a cognitive scientist, if you haven't seen her TED Talk, go out and look at it, find it. It's fabulous.
Fantastic.
And she talks about the minds of babies and young children and how they use scientific thinking, like statistics, to figure things out, and why that's kind of super creative, inquisitive minds of our youngest children desperately need to be nurtured and appreciated. So as educators, I don't think we dream of depriving young children of early literacy experiences like reading them stories, but we risk doing, that kind of neglect of all, STEM stuff in early childhood. If children are like curious about the world and how it works, and we're not fulfilling that drive in them, I think we're losing an opportunity to build up their knowledge banks. And I think as educators, that's the last thing we want to do. We're trying to encourage, opportunities and learning and knowledge building. So we should be taking advantage of the STEM learning to do that.
I think that what you mentioned about the messages as well, that it's even if you didn't do the kind of the concepts, it's those messages, particularly girls are getting, are so important in the early years, moving away from the stereotypes and being really conscious what we say and the unconscious messages that we're giving. And I suppose that brings us on to the next thing I wanted to kind of tease out with you a bit, bringing in your master's study about the role that play has in, how we support children's inquiry and investigation into these areas through play and through being co-players, as you talk about.
Yeah, so for me, with young children, play is, a really crucial part of the STEM picture. So sometimes people talk about STEM as STEAM, and I know you talked to Sandra about that in an earlier podcast. So STEAM would be including the arts in STEM learning. So I think of it as like play is another type of creative process. So I think of play as being a part of that for the arts and STEAM learning. So Vygotsky's would describe play, and they really are talking about sociodramatic play here, as the leading activity for young children. So it leads their development, it brings them on in all kinds of ways, cognitively, emotionally, socially. Now, if you can combine STEM with play, for me, you have a child who is learning STEM concepts and skills in ways that's motivated by their play. And I think that's just a wonderful idea. So say a child is curious about something like dinosaurs. So they might have books about dinosaurs, they might watch some TV shows or movies about dinosaurs. But if we can support that learning through play as educators, that's going to motivate that child to learn more. And if we're co-playing with young children, which is what my research is about, and also what Marilyn Fleer is doing in her conceptual play worlds in Australia, we're really well placed to support young children's learning in the moment of play. So imagine that child then who's curious about dinosaurs, so they're pretending to be a triceratops. I think about how an educator playing alongside that child, but letting the child lead the play and support that child's learning. So number one, you're supporting their emergent interests. Number two, your curriculum's being led by the child's inquiries. That's all, ticking boxes in Ashter. And then you can play alongside the child and give them the chance to ask questions like, what kind of food is the triceratops going to eat? What sounds does it make? What kind of teeth does a triceratops have? How does it protect itself? And again, all those lovely I wonder questions, I wonder what would happen if the T-Rex came. I wonder what would happen if, if it got scared because the T-Rex roared at it. Maybe I'll be the T-Rex, and I'll do a roar. And how are you going to protect yourself? So that's very motivating for a young child because they love to play and they love to do sociodramatic play and play these different characters. So imagine that if you're playing with that child and you're very cleverly and subtly throwing in all that little bits of STEM learning and STEM concepts in there during the play. So it's play, which is what the child wants, but it's also learning, which is what we're driving that for. And if you can do that, and the two things can be done together, sure, everyone's happy, I think.
There's a knack, I presume, as you immerse yourself in that kind of play, around knowing when to be a co-player and following the lead of the child, that you're co-playing, but the child as the leader rather than the adult taking on the kind of teaching role. Is there something in
absolutely. And I did a lot of thinking about that, and just based on my own practice, and really I really analyzed that during my master's about what was my role and what worked well for the child and what didn't work well for the child. And there's been a bit of research done around this, and what it seems to show is that if you're playing the role of the leader, well, then it's not really the child's play anymore, whereas if you're allowing the child to be the leader and them to dictate the rules of the game and what's happening in the game, and you're really clear about that as an educator from the outset, that's really important, and that you're very careful about the way you're bringing in your teaching moments as well. So it's not teaching, that it's just little subtle things that you're dropping into the conversation or that you're exploring together, and that it's based on the child's motivation. So you're not going in and going, today we're going to learn about dinosaurs, and you're going to be a dinosaur and I'm going to be a dinosaur, but this is what we're going to do. But if the child is being a dinosaur, maybe you're going, oh, are you hungry? What do you think dinosaur? What do you think that triceratops eat? Let's go over to the kitchen and we'll make some of that. And you could bring in conversation about, how would the dinosaur? How do you think that triceratops would eat that? And what kind of teeth would you say that triceratops would have? And then really getting into the play, But also there's lovely things you can do around the planning of those play moments. So before you start into the play, where you actually plan it with the child. Where are we going to play this game? What are we going to need? Is there a costume you want to wear? So there's loads of those higher order thinking skills, like the planning and the analysing going on before you start the game at all. And that's really good for children's cognitive development as well.
So Nicola, just as we kind of start to come to the end, have you some kind of top tips on, and you've given some really great suggestions already, but how educators can kind of start and support this type of play, and we've talked with Sandra a little bit about the science and maybe a little bit about engineering, and we're going to be talking about technology. Have you thoughts more, on the whole area, but maybe particularly how we spot engineering at work in children's play as well?
Yeah, so I think for me, sociodramatic play is, it's such a wonderful way for children to explore STEM concepts, and they fit so nicely together, I think. So when you're playing with young children, and they love to play with adults, they really do, and a lot of my investigations in my master's came from the fact that children were always asking me to play with them. And you're playing with young children, you really get to understand what their questions are and what their interests are. And if you start with that, and then you start thinking about, what are children investigating here? What do they want to know about here? They often link back to STEM concepts, so they might be about living things, or in the example I gave about dinosaurs. But even if you're talking about something like Elsa, there's loads of STEM concepts in that, about water and ice and changing materials, So, and then of course there's loads of building you can do, you're building Elsa's castle and knocking it down, and there's so many fun STEM concepts you can investigate naturally through the child's play. So we talk a little bit about engineering then. So if you think about what engineers do, they're coming up with real world solutions to problems. So, it might be bridges or roads or medical instruments or food production. In every facet of life, there's an engineer there somewhere having designed something. So children in their play are also coming up with real world solutions to problems that they have. So something like, how can I be Elsa and make an ice castle? How can I make this car slide down this ramp? How can I build this tower and make it higher and higher, even for very young babies? Those are, there are STEM concepts within those inquiries those children have. So a lot of children's play, but especially I think sociodramatic play, physical play, small world play and block play involve engineering problems that require engineering solutions. So maybe to give an example of that, so say, getting back to Elsa, I seem to be talking a lot about Elsa today, but maybe a child might say, I want to build a rocket that's going to take me and my 4 friends to Elsa's castle really quickly. So the children could be supported by an educator to solve that problem in a way that encourages them to use engineering thinking. So to solve the problem in a kind of a systematic way. So rather than a child becoming frustrated that the solution that they came up with didn't work, or maybe they didn't have the support they needed to kind of take their lovely, super creative ideas and put it into action. So there's this thing called an engineering design process, And NASA have a model of it called the NASA BEST model, and it involves 6 steps. So there's ask, imagine, plan, create, test, and improve. Those are the 6 steps. So asking is, what's the problem that needs to be solved? Imagine is, what are the constraints? What has, where have people solved this problem before? Planning then is brainstorming solutions and getting really creative and collaborating with each other on it. Then you create it. So you're going to make something, make one of your ideas, and then you're going to test it out, figure out what went wrong, if there's problems with it, and then you improve it. So the Museum of Science in Boston also have a really simplified version of that for younger children with 3 steps: explore, create, and improve. So if we think about that in terms of the rocket problem we had, so the child might say, well, what's the problem? They want to create a rocket for 5 children. And what's the educator doing? So the educator is, helping the children question and wondering about that and encouraging them to come up with a plan. And then the next step is imagine. So maybe the children only have the constraint is that they only have a cardboard box or a few chairs rather than 6 chairs. And then they might research on the iPad. So they're bringing in that technology piece and they're looking up other ways people have made rockets before. And then the educator's role is maybe to be, writing it down on the whiteboard, putting up their ideas there, and, again, questioning and supporting them. And then the next step is the plan. So they might start drawing out designs or talking about the designs they're thinking of. And the educator's role there is maybe supporting social emotional learning. So helping them share their ideas, and then maybe giving them pens and papers to draw out their ideas, or helping them wonder aloud about the practical side of it, like safety. And then the next step is creating. So they're going to make the rocket out of the cardboard and maybe cushions or chairs. And they might cut out windows out of it and make a cone for the top of it. So the educator's role then is, obviously supporting them with creating that, giving them resources, again, lots of wondering and questioning, social support, if they might need help with conflict, and then they test it out. So maybe when they test it out, the cone might fall off the top of it, or maybe the windows were too small, or they want to change the color of it to blue because Elsa likes blue, maybe, So the educator then is recording maybe what's happening, helping them with the emotional fallout. So if they're disappointed that it's fallen apart, the educator is there to help them deal with that disappointment and encourage them to keep going. And then the last step is improving. And for me, this is the most important step. So looking at what went wrong and thinking about how they can improve it. So maybe the cool glue gun is going to work better than the tape that they used to stick the cone on. Maybe blue is looking really nice, but they found some Elsa stickers and they want to stick them onto it. So again, the educator's role is helping them with practical stuff, also helping them to identify what the problems are so they can solve them, because you don't know how to solve it unless you know what the problem is. And again, helping with social and emotional and all that. So you can see that the children can go through this 6-step process, and that the process doesn't end with frustration if it doesn't work out. It's just that feeling of, well, it went wrong, but that's okay. We can improve it. And if it still goes wrong, we can improve it again and we can test it again. So there's no failures for children. There's only opportunities for more improvements. And I think we all need less failure and less talk of failure and more encouragement to keep going, So it's very empowering for children. They can have these ideas and they can put them into practice with the support of the educator, and they can achieve new things, But also children are learning how to be engineers, and they're calling themselves engineers, and you can encourage them to call themselves engineers. And that opens up all kinds of opportunities for children long term, because the research shows that children actually, once they do these kind of, engineering projects, they see that engineering is not gendered, that it's actually for boys and for girls, and that as men and women, anyone can be an engineer. And that's, again, really positive in terms of the gender problems around and getting rid of that.
Absolutely. It's and even if you were to start with the simplified process, for educators, was it explore, create, and approve? You said was the simplified one.
Yeah.
There are 3 really good steps to start with, and then branch into the fuller framework that you went through there.
And if you go on to, if educators are interested in that, if you want the Museum of Science Boston's website, you can download a free resource, a sample resource from there that brings you through that process for young children, and it's completely free. And they've got ideas for different projects you can do to get started. So
when you were talking there too about the the learning from the mistakes and kind of doing away with the idea of failure. I read somewhere sometime that Edison, when he was very close to finally cracking the electric light, his workshop went up in flames. And somebody said to him, "Oh my God, your life's work has gone." And he said, "No, all my mistakes are now behind me. It's forward from now on." And within 3 weeks, he had found what the missing bit. And I often think of it, there's so much, to kind of, learn from it and move on rather than dwelling on the past. You can't do anything about it at that point.
That's
Nicola,
it. That's
thanks
it.
so much. There's so much experience and expertise there. I think there's so much to unpick, and thank you so much for sharing it all with us. It's been lovely talking to you.
And to you as well, Maura. I've really enjoyed chatting with you.
And thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed this episode, please tell your friends and colleagues, and remember to tune in for the next episode. Thanks for listening.